the generous introduction, and thank you for having me here and for pulling it off, and for the whole team to organizing this amazing undertaking and making it happen. So my paper is going to be philosophical. It's going to be about perception and consciousness, and about how AI and machine vision are shifting their discursive and material parameters of both. But I will use the examples and metaphors of media, photography and computational imaging and cinema to explore the problem. This is the way I kind of mainly work. So I try to combine the two. So thinking with media and through media about some of the kind of concepts and problems that have been of interest to this conference. I also have an art practice of mine, and I won't be talking about it that much today, but in the background at some point I'll be showing a couple of small pieces. So. But I would like, by way of introducing my talk is also going to be quite visual, so if you get bored, you can just switch off from listening to me and look at the pictures, because there is going to be a whole alternative track playing in the background. So I'll start from a 1-minute clip that kind of introduces what I'm doing.
Yes. Okay. So, this is iteration 89 of the nematode simulation. 302 neurons mapped. Nurture data tracked from moment of first cell division. Beautiful. Okay, synchronize.
Synchronizing. In 3, 2, 1, go.
Overlay, please.
Here comes overlay.
Whoa.
That's impressive.
Thank you.
Okay, so these people were looking at 10 seconds into the future, the worm's future, that is. And this was a restaging of the WormBot project, a digital simulation of the behavior of a nematode worm represented in the form of image-lapse images with a view to predicting the worm's death. The idea was to create a living organism in a computer system by rendering all of its neural connections in a digital form. Here it was happening as part of the first episode of a TV series called Devs, directed by Alex Garland. So after 10 seconds, the correlation between the simulated screen movement and its predicted graphic visualization was lost, but the salad-eating professor lookalike boss was impressed enough to elevate the young Russian AI programmer to the next phase of the company's project, the eponymous Devs. So the project lab, hosted in a vacuum-protected Faraday cage in the middle of a forest, contains a hugely powerful quantum computer whose goal was to achieve for the billions of neurons in the human brain what the WormBot lookalike did for nematodes 302 neurons. So this mad professor, boss lookalike figure, a Deus-like character called Forrest, has built his whole enterprise, that's the guy here with a halo over his head, he's built a whole enterprise to generate an alternative version of reality online, not one in which his wife and young daughter don't die in a car crash inadvertently caused by him. In other words, Forrest wants to overcome the causality of the physical world by creating one in which a different future can unfold, a future he will be able to inhabit together with his digitally restored family. So the Dev series deals with the age-old problem of determinism versus free will, packaging it as a fairly conventional family story. Now, what is of particular interest to me about devs in the context of this talk and this conference is the visualization of the problem of using AI to predict the future by capturing an image of it. The first step involves the mobilization of the power of the said quantum computer to render detailed images from a remote past. Borrowing from the past's multiverse simulations allows the dev's developers to obtain a rich enough data set to generate adequate images of the past. Jesus on the cross, oh, that's what Jesus looks like, or prehistorical people making cave art. So the next step will involve using the technology and data from Forrest's more recent past to render a new version of the future for him and his family. I would like to bracket the determinism debate and the rather implausible quantum frippery to focus on the very idea of rendering the future as an image. So for me, DERV serves as a framing device for the key question that will drive my talk. Can you not just imagine, but also image the future? Can you photograph it? To explore these questions, I will look at the temporality of the digital image while engaging with the latest developments in AI-driven computational photography and machine vision, technologies which are premised on forecasting an image and then making it look real. Drawing on neuroscience research on the role of prediction in human consciousness and the application of machine learning to developing machine consciousness, I will talk about the mobilization of photo rendering in predictive technology in areas such as weather forecasts, stock markets, epidemiology, and consumer behavior. I will also consider the socio-political consequences of the implementation of predictive technology in our lives. Last but not least, I will explore the possibility of imagining and imaging better futures. Now, the question about the possibility of photographing the future may seem both absurd and out of date. Marty McFly already videoed it back in 1985, as some of you might remember from Back to the Future. Yet the premise behind it underpins many of the current developments in imaging technology, computation, and AI. Indeed, photography poses us with a temporal conundrum, both on the level of physics and common sense. As a medium, photography has typically been associated with the past. It has been constituted as a quintessential medium of memory, of time gone by, or even death. Logically, it's only the present that can ever be photographed, but the present itself is an elusive concept, unable to be captured in an image or thought without simultaneously receding to the past. Photographic technology has always played with logic and physics to create a spectral ambience around its practices. We can think here of long exposure photography, where several hours were required to obtain an image trace on the not-so-sensitive substrate in the early days of the medium. There are also photographic dispatches from a pre-human past, such as the visual rendering of the data captured by a radio telescope in June 2005, of solar dust cloud radiation in the Taurus molecular cloud, where the data represented an event that took place in 1585 or thereabouts, or even a baby picture of our universe produced by NASA and showing the map of the cosmic microwave background radiation supposedly released as heat during the Big Bang. The temporal determination of a photograph depends on the point of reference, specifically on the positioning of the observer within the system. Time is what it is only for an observer whose life is grasped as a timeline. Outside the observer, the human observer, there is just change. In its computational guise, photography can therefore be said to have warped the arrow of time, displacing temporality as we know it and sense with our bodies and minds with the machinic logic of multiplication and nonlinear choice. In our smartphones, a photograph is now an extraction of an image from a sequence, coupled with an averaging of that sequence. Or as developer Vasily Zubarev puts it, when you tap the Take a Photo button on your phone, the photo has actually already been taken. In the computational images of the world, as deployed by the latest smartphone cameras, such as Google's Pixel or Apple's iPhone, the future literally influences the past. Yet it's not so much the already well-studied relationship between photography and time that interests me here, but rather and more specifically, the relationship between photography and the future. I want to approach it by looking at the problem of prediction and the mobilization of photography and other forms of imaging in constructing predictions in different disciplines, from cognitive psychology and neuroscience through to AI, machine learning, and computer vision. I'm mindful here of Matthew Cobb's suggestion made in the book The Idea of the Brain, the Past and Future of Neuroscience, that our scientific horizon at any given time depends on the technological metaphors we use, but also that those very metaphors reflect the technical knowledge of the time, its discourses and vocabularies. Metaphors can flow both ways, says Cobb. Since its invention in the early 19th century, photography has been intrinsically linked with neuroscience, both enabling the neuroscientific image practice and shaping the understanding of the working of neurological processes, from memory through to learning. Indeed, it was in terms of imprinting on the brain's tissue and its neural extensions that early research in neurology explained perception and action in humans. This perhaps goes some way towards explaining the key role of the concept of the mental image in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. Since the middle of the 20th century, the photographic discourse has been supplemented by concepts and metaphors from computing, describing the working of the neural system with reference to feedback loops, information, codes, and computation. And obviously, we've seen some of these shifts played out throughout this conference as well, and the vocabularies that have shaped our own conversations. Interestingly, Cobb points out that even though we now stand on the brink of understanding how patterns of activity in networks of neurons create perception, some scientists sense we are approaching an impasse in how we understand the brain. The computer metaphor in particular is said to have reached its limit, with the proliferation of brain data being accompanied by frequent resignation on the part of human interpreters to its voluminous excess and unexplainability. And obviously, as you know, there is a lot of research on unexplainability. It's therefore worth probing whether current changes to the photographic medium that are occurring in its encounter with computation, network technologies, AI, and machine vision are altering in any way the neuroscientific horizon, and in particular, our understanding of neural processes related to imaging and perception. What is the mental image today, and what can it become? Can we learn to see ourselves and our world better once we have changed our metaphors? The concept of the mental image, referring to quasi-perceptual experience which is pre-linguistic and which forms the basis of what we now understand as consciousness, has a centuries-long history in Western epistemology, an aspect of representationalist thinking unfolding across centuries, which posited that ideas were just pictures in our mind. The concept has now lost its literal connotations without challenging the implicit primacy of visuality in our understanding of knowledge production. Indeed, imagery has become the generally accepted term amongst cognitive scientists for quasi-perceptual experience in any sense mode, with the term embracing auditory, olfactory, kinesthetic, and haptic images alongside visual ones. For example, Google is now referring to machine perception instead of machine vision, and that's what its kind of key research database for those kinds of problems is called. The fact that the image still constitutes a cornerstone of the neuroscientific rhetorical register delineates a particular conceptual trajectory for the discipline. It prescribes what can be seen and said and how. So in what follows, I want to look at the use of the concept of the image in the current theories of consciousness as outlined by two of its leading researchers who are also known for writing for wider audiences, neuroscientist Antonio Damasio and neuroscientist Anil Seth. Damasio and Seth are both physicalists, or what we know in media theory as materialists, yet in their respective theories they go beyond mere functionalism. This is to say, they recognize the role of the body and its situatedness in the world in the making of consciousness, a shared assumption that differentiates them from a variety of cognitive scientists currently involved in modeling human intelligence and human vision in machines. But they are also interesting for me because of the different rhetorical registers through which they articulate their positions, coming respectively from image theory and information science. In the further part of the talk, I will look at the role of images in Damasio's and Seth's respective theories of perception, at the link between perception, prediction, and imaging in those theories, and last but not least, at the possibility of conceptualizing consciousness as a person's orientation towards the future, which involves making images of that future. Sorry, just something's happened here. Bear with me a minute. Okay, so for years avoided by scientists as exclusively focused on an individual's self and hence impossible to study objectively, consciousness, as we've seen throughout our discussions here over the last few days, consciousness has recently gained a new respectability as a domain of scientific inquiry, partly thanks to the encounter between neuroscience and the multidisciplinary field of artificial intelligence. Some go so far as to argue, as somebody did, Otto, on the first day, that work on AI should in fact be recognized as an attempt to create artificial consciousness. So defined by Damasio as an organism's awareness of its own self and surroundings, consciousness is broadly understood as a first-person phenomenon which unfolds as part of a private first-person process to which we give the name mind. Damasio distinguishes between core consciousness, which is a sense of the here and now, and is also likely to be found in other animals, and extended consciousness, which spans one's lifetime, requires memory and attention, and is enhanced by language. Interestingly, it is through references to the metaphorical apparatus of image-making that Damasio explains the working of those two types of consciousness. He proposes that core consciousness includes an inner sense based on images, and that those are images of feelings. Responding to stimuli, which are experienced by us as feelings, the brain makes patterns in the circuits of its neural cells. We could call these patterns impressions or imprints. Damasio concludes that to understand consciousness, we primarily need to understand the problem of mental images, that is, of how the brain inside the human organism engenders the mental patterns we call, for lack of a better word, the images of an object. Where the object may be material, a person, a place, or immaterial, a melody, a toothache. An image, in turn, stands for a mental pattern in any of the sensory modalities. For example, a sound image, a tactile image, the image of a state of well-being. But then a shift happens in Damasio's narrative, where he's getting his media purposefully, yet somewhat unexpectedly mixed. He says, the first problem of consciousness is the problem of how we get a movie in the brain, relying on what he himself describes as a rough metaphor. He also highlights that the movie has as many sensory tracks as our nervous system has sensory portals: sight, sound, taste, and olfaction, tooth, inner senses. Some interesting form of mediation is activating here, with the brain positioned as the cinematic screen. Also, an odd circularity creeps into Damasio's argument as part of the mediation process, with images functioning as stand-ins for his inability to explain the sequence of events in the production of consciousness. Damasio goes so far as to acknowledge that we have to explain not only how the movie in the brain is generated, assuming that there is a movie, of course, but also how the brain generates the sense that there is an owner, an observer of that movie. If consciousness does behave like a movie, it's like a retro-silent one, as language is only believed to arise at a later stage. The brain as screen is perhaps less like a conventional cinema screen and more like the 1950s Circorama, renamed Circle Vision at an Expo exhibition in New York a decade later, with screens surrounding the viewer from all angles, but also requiring the viewer's corporeal movement to appreciate the experience fully. The viewer only becomes a viewer through their 360-degree mobility in the image space. This sense of the image envelope that requires mobile attention from the viewer returns in VR and 3D gaming, with the viewer's or player's positioning resembling an M.C. Escher drawing in which the movie dreams itself up as a movie, playing in a theater with an audience. The viewer is thus both inside the image and watching the image. That sense of the self-generativity of experience from within the image envelope is something that is being used in current experiments with machine learning and AI that involve an attempt to recreate the human experience of perception, or rather the externally perceptible aspects of that experience in machines. Google's Deep Dream algorithm, developed in 2015, allowed for the production of images in which non-existent objects were discovered by running previously trained neural network models on those images multiple times. This resulted in infamous images showing spaghetti with eyes, camel birds, and psychedelic squiggles covering familiar landscapes. This aesthetic, short-lived as it was, became known as Inceptionism, a term derived from the network paper by Lin and others in conjunction with the famous "We Need to Go Deeper" internet meme. So Lin and colleagues' 2012 paper proposed a deep network structure called network-in-network, which was to be used to enhance model discriminability for local patches within their receptive field. The operations of recurrent neural networks are meant to recreate the posited experience of human perception and human learning, producing images and then feeding them into the network to create more or more detailed or deeper images. Yet the computational model of perception in AI research can be described as perhaps reductionist, as it brackets off both the human body and its movement in the environment as not so vital aspects of the perceptive process. This logic is replicated in the current design of neural networks, algorithms whose name is strictly and restrictively metaphorical, as there is nothing neural about those networks, and I know maybe some members of the audience might disagree with that. What is modeled more accurately from the human organism is the sense of recurrence or circularity, whereby the elements produced as part of the work of the machine's posited intelligence are themselves producing that intelligence. As mentioned before, consciousness would be a more appropriate term here, perhaps. So bringing together all the constitutive elements, Damasio puts forward the following schema for the image-based operations of consciousness in humans. The worldless narrative is based on neural patterns which become images, images being the same fundamental currency in which the description of the consciousness-causing object is also carried out. Most importantly, the images that constitute the narrative are incorporated in the stream of thoughts. The images in the consciousness narrative flow like shadows along with the images of the object for which they are providing an unwitting, unsolicited comment. To come back to the metaphor of movie in the brain, they are within the movie. There is no external spectator. So a number of things are intriguing about this schema for me. First, it's the perceived need to split the process of the emergence of consciousness into two phases. The worldless narrative of images, even though it's still called a narrative by Damasio, one whose role is to describe the object, perceived, or comment on images of the object, and the subsequent timeline of thoughts, which are not yet words. Second, it's the distinction between images in the consciousness narrative and images of the object. The first kind of images function like cybernetic mirrors. They produce consciousness by providing an image of the self, or more precisely of the self's body, that is then being incorporated into the picture of the self. I'm calling this mirror cybernetic because of the feedback loops effect required for its operation. Yet it's not a straightforward device that forms images by reflection. The cybernetic mirror producing consciousness by way of making images is more like the magic mirror envisaged by Escher, where the reflection becomes part of the scene being reflected. The two strands and two timelines of those images seem to overlap and merge, collapsing the odd Platonism of Damasio's theatre of consciousness, in which shadows appear before objects into a more contemporary version of the screening venue, a movie theatre. The supposed cinematic experience is staged by the brain for us, an experience that's also said to generate us in the process. Yet it's worth delving a little deeper into the mixed media metaphors here and realize that consciousness doesn't really have the designed smoothness of a VR or immersive gaming experience. Damasio himself acknowledges that core consciousness is generated in pulse-like fashion, for each content of which we are to become conscious. Indeed, we flit in and out of consciousness, both during our sleep, when it's only in the relatively short time of deep sleep that our consciousness is suspended, and in daytime. To continue with the media metaphor, consciousness is therefore perhaps more like an experimental modernist short, one that is made up of still photographs, multiple exposure frames, slow-mo animations, and material scratches on a film surface. The role of the body, foregrounded in the formal experiments of modernist filmmakers such as Eisenstein, Hans Richter, and Alexander Rodchenko, is crucial in the creation and, of course, perception of the movie. We could say that there is no movie without a body. As Damasio puts it, The images you form in your mind always signal to the organism its own engagement with the business of making images. The human body therefore presents itself as a self-camera, or perhaps a selfie camera. The images are needed to generate us, but the sense of us emerges only through action. We become us by imaging and hence imagining ourselves into being, we could say. The image of the organism that we internally create for ourselves to map out not yet quite our external boundaries and help maintain our life becomes a blueprint for the imaging of the self that is subsequently seen as living that life. Importantly, this image, this original image of the organism, needs to be followed by many others. Indeed, in order to know how to act, we need what Damasio refers to as good images. Yet it's not only through somewhat confusing spatiality in which a reflection becomes an image that Damasio conveys the working of consciousness to us. His model also entails a warped temporality. While core consciousness, as he figuratively puts it, doesn't illuminate the future, extended consciousness involves holding an image over time, which is another name for the process of memory. Drawing on the famous experiment conducted in the 1980s by Benjamin Libet on the relationship between stimulus, reaction, and consciousness, which showed the delay in our consciousness catching up with our body, Damasio points out that we are always hopelessly late for consciousness, the lateness amounting to about 500 milliseconds. This presumed lateness has led philosophers and neuroscientists to interrogate whether our actions are indeed caused by brain activity or whether they are pre-programmed all along. In that latter scenario, consciousness only catches up with our activity 500 milliseconds later, and thus only provides a report on the activity rather than being its source of origin. The varied responses in the science community to the relationship between consciousness, brain, and body reflects the diverse set of positions on consciousness today, which are in turn underpinned by diverse approaches to the age-old problem of determinism and free will. So that brings me back to Devs, which could be read as a parable for illustrating that problem. The orchestrator of the Devs enterprise, that kind of guy, this mad professor, entrepreneur, Forrest, believes there is no such thing as free will. As mentioned previously, he is mourning his family's death in a car crash, which was caused by his wife while she was on the phone to him, making him a contributor to the crash. Yet for Forrest, we all ran on tram lines. This means that his wife and daughter died in the crash because they were always going to die in it, with the tracks of causality extending well beyond and ahead of any individual's actions or acts of will. This belief in the determinism of the universe provides solace to his guilt, but also a recipe for trying to recreate another universe in which a different set of events would be guaranteed to unfold, one that would be more satisfactory to its designer's wishes. Through a trick of smoke and mirrors involving a lot of misuse of the term quantum, things both do and do not go according to plan. A young programmer, Lily, a heroine on the quest to revenge the death of her Russian spy boyfriend and save the world from Forrest's divine machinations, and one whose heroic adventure has already been predicted by Forrest's all-seeing computer, at the last moment throws out the gun she was supposed to use to kill the Devs, Deus Devs, you get the pun, Devs master, thus messing up the prediction algorithm. Yet both Lily and Forrest do die in the altercation. You've got the sequence of events here. So she's trying to make him not die and break the predicted future that they've seen in one of the many kind of quantum visualizations, and yet they still die. Anyway, once the cage that held them falls down, there's joining the rendered universe on the other side of the screen, in which Forrest is reunited with his family, while Lily is dating her other good boyfriend. The philosophical dilemma as to whether they are still themselves in the rendered universe or whether they are mere digital copies of themselves that just look like them to an outsider observer is closed off by the foundational assumption in Forrest's mind, in that kind of guy's mind, that drives the show, as well as a lot of AI research, that both perception and consciousness are computational. For devs, it also means that it is possible for the characters to experience themselves as continuous and unified, not just across time, which we all do every day on waking up, but also across platforms and media. Commenting on the science behind the show, computer science professor Scott Aronson is rather skeptical about devs' overuse of the term quantum with reference to what is complexity. Indeed, complexity is the reason computer developers from the scene discussed at the beginning of my talk are unable to see more than 10 seconds into the future, into the worm's future. Aronson then adds acerbically, predicting the weather 3 weeks from now might be forever impossible. So I'm moving now to the third part of my talk, which will kind of lead to a conclusion, and wanted to point out that a number of successful predictions do, of course, happen every day, albeit at smaller scales and temporal ranges. And they do have profound significance, not just for how we can live our lives, but also for how we can understand ourselves better. Yet their operating model is somewhat different than claimed by Libet and taken up by devs. Neuroscientist Anil Seth draws on the more recent research by Aaron Schruger to provide an interpretation of Libet's experiment, which suggests that the assessment of the brain's readiness potential to initiate a given action was itself an artifact of the process of measuring that potential, and only something that could be captured retrospectively. According to Seth, you will see something that looks like a readiness potential if you look back in time from moments of fast responses. This allows him to interpret the brain's supposed readiness as an accumulation of sensory data from which the brain can make a best guess. The brain is therefore not ready for a specific action. It has to create this action by envisaging the external state of events and those events unfolding. The act of envisaging itself is a simulation of probabilities, aka a prediction of best guesses, not of a foretelling of what will most definitely happen. So this statement supports Seth's account of consciousness as the organism's ability to make predictions, and we'll return to this point shortly. For now, I want to focus on another aspect of Seth's argument, namely his conclusion that free will is a perceptual experience, a statement that allows him to reconcile our inner sense of agency with causality of the laws of physics as we know them. Yet this is a stronger claim than might initially seem, because for Seth, the only way we can know anything internally, that is ourselves, or externally, the world, is through our experience of it, which are clusters of perceptions. So we could go so far as to say, as Seth indeed does, that our sense of self is produced through the process of future forwarding, that is, looking at what becomes ourselves at regular intervals, while trying to guess the causes of the sensory signals being received. For Seth, Descartes' I think, therefore I am, becomes an I predict, therefore I am, or even I predict myself, therefore I am. This argument is encapsulated by his proposition that our brains are Bayesian prediction machines, attempting to guess the causes of sensory signals from the perceptual inferences they receive. I'm interested in this formulation and the idea behind this concept of the prediction machine for two reasons: the posited role of perception in the constitution of the self and the figure of the machine in explaining consciousness. In Seth's framework, prediction and perception are inextricably interwoven. The brain is continually generating predictions about sensory signals and comparing these predictions with the sensory signals that arrive at the eyes and the ears and the nose, the skin, and so on. His post-Cartesian quip could therefore be articulated as, I perceive myself, therefore I am. This theory confirms the constitutive role of perception in the emergence of both ourself and of what we call the world. Yet even though multisensory perception is such a strong aspect of his framework of thought, Seth is far less inclined than Damasio to resort to media metaphors, be they still or moving image-based, to explain it. Instead, his rhetorical register with its signals, inputs, outputs, inferences, controls, and Bayesian guesses is primarily driven from cybernetics, information theory, and computer science. Yet it's Seth's model of consciousness and selfhood. Seth's models of consciousness and selfhood is not computational in the sense it's used in devs or applied in machine vision research. for whom consciousness is phenomenological. It's always a consciousness of something, which means it's embodied and embedded in the world. So you need to kind of go out of the 2D dimension, kind of processing and mapping and modeling, to extend that into something more complex and to account for movement. Echoing the sentiment well known to Marxists, visual culture theorists, and other humanities scholars for decades, namely that how things seem is a poor guide to how they actually are, Seth's theory redefines perception as controlled hallucination. The notion of systemic control is important to it, with conscious experiences being described, to use Giulio Tononi and Gerald Edelman's term, as informative and integrated. The sense of integration is important for the execution of the ultimate function of perception, enabling, via a series of prediction-driven actions, our survival in the world. We could perhaps suggest that the role of perception is to enable control over what we might call, counter Damasio, our self-image, or to go all the way down the imagistic metaphor whirlwind to photograph ourselves into existence. If memory for Damasio, as much as for Bergson, involves holding an image over time, selfhood and self-consciousness, with its foundational aspect, requires an incessant production of such images. Another way of putting it would be that we photograph ourselves into being. And of course, since I've been dealing with chains of metaphors, we are aware that this is what I'm doing here. The model that emerges here is not that of a movie in the brain, an avant-garde silent film, or even a poorly edited and choppy YouTube video, but rather that of a Polaroid print, albeit one updated for a digital age. But we also make the world by making images of it. This is to say that not only do we photograph ourselves into being, we also make the world into what it is for us by making images of it over and over again. It needs to be acknowledged that stuff, aka matter, or if you want to call it, does exist out there, of course, without our perception or other forms of intervention. At least that's where I stand. But for it to become something for us, we need to see, and then for it to become what we see and call the world, it needs this imagistic process to be instantiated. Needless to say, its outcome could look very different for different species. Again, the Russian pavilion. Seth explicitly rejects the idea of the brain as a kind of computer in the skull, processing sensory information to build an inner picture of the outside world for the benefit of the self through feature detection. Nor does he partake of the image register to explain what happens. So the brain is not an imaging machine for him, transmitting results from features detected in the world and thus producing their mere reflections. In Seth's model, perceptions don't come directly from outside, from sensory impulses. They come from the brain's predictions about the causes of these sensory signals. Building on the notion of perception as inference, Seth puts forward his idea of a prediction machine, which is a creative and interpretative device and not just a recording one. Yet this is perhaps too rigid an opposition, given that prediction and imaging can't be so easily decoupled, or that they are in fact being increasingly linked in various imaging technologies, from computational photography, AI and CGI, through to what has become known as predtech. We are, of course, dealing here with an expanded understanding of images, one that involves a shift from seeing photography as passive transmission of what is out there in the world, through to an active creation of that world, through the conjoined human-machinic apparatus. Even if we are to agree that perception is not a reading of the world out there and that it is a controlled hallucination, although I understand might be a big if for some, a way of dreaming up the world on the basis of the data received from it, that proposition surely calls for an expanded sense of media through which such a hallucination could occur and present itself to us. Even though Seth explicitly rejects the model of the computer, his preference for information theory as the organizer of his metaphorical horizon effectively ends up turning the brain into a high-level processing unit that transforms sensory signal inputs into abstract predictions and then spits them out as perceptions. What format and what medium these predictions come in remains unanswered in his theory. The linguistic paradigm, which is inadvertently introduced into Seth's information-driven model, misses out on the creative possibility of the imagistic apparatus. What's more concerning for me is that his model also plays into the hand of those who want to posit prediction as a medium-independent process that can be done better and faster by machines, especially those of non-human variety. And with this, we enter the weird world of predtech, predictive technology. So this development, long preceding advanced research in machine vision and machine learning, was already envisaged by French philosopher Paul Virilio in his 1988 book, Vision Machine. Virilio's analysis was premised on developments taking place in artificial intelligence in the 80s, long before the emergence of deep learning and machine vision premised on recursive neural nets. Virilio warned us against the automation of perception, coupled with the production of synthetic imagery that had no indexical reference to anything we recognized as reality beyond verisimilitude. Virilio therefore knew that prediction was in fact a creation. The obfuscation of this fact by the photorealism of the media through which the forecasting is delivered has serious consequences for ourselves as both individual selves and political subjects. Virilio analyzed its working in military technology, with war maneuvers and war's outcomes increasingly being simulated on geographically remote screens. Today, predtech is widely deployed in areas such as finance, weather prediction, epidemiology and cancer detection, consumer behavior, crime prevention. Combining data mining, neural network analysis, and visual rendering, it stages visual scenarios while also making realities. To explain the working of predtech, marketing technology company Bluecore uses the example of a fuzzy picture which is gradually filled in with more data, probably scripted off Instagram, but comparing traditional marketing to taking a very zoomed-in view of a photograph, they pride themselves on using AI to provide a bigger picture. Yet the process of rendering this picture not only creates an image of their clients' customers, but also creates customers, shaping their desires, choices, and actions, while simultaneously rendering the very idea of a desirable customer based for the customer basis for the client using Bluecore's predictive technology. For example, they say, you can use it to calculate a customer's predicted lifetime value, helping your team focus on customers that will drive the most revenue long term. This process is also in operation in other areas where the use of resources, especially those of human nature, is to be optimized. As of 2013, Hewlett-Packard was predictively scoring its more than 300,000 workers with the probability of whether they'd quit their job. HP called this the flight risk score, and it was delivered to managers. I'm sure it's soon going to be implemented in universities as well. So predtech, therefore, not only predicts what's going to happen, but also makes things happen. Not only can it create bad workers by reporting on them as potentially less reliable and steady in advance of anything actually happening, while also shaping punitive management tactics, it also designates certain areas and certain groups of people as less desirable and less valuable, as poorer, weaker, and more prone to crime. And therefore, machines photograph the future for us, imaging into existence through publicity and simulation, both our desires and the world to come. It was recently reported that AI will not just help us find things, it will generate what we're actually seeking. Scott Prevost of Adobe Sensei, an AI and machine learning section of the creative imaging software company, explains that soon the search function will be able to apply machine learning to blend assets and create an image that never existed before, an image that's exactly what you had in your imagination, like yay. Although presented as a useful feature for all sorts of creatives, it's easy to envisage that technology being utilized to enhance the malfunctioning of platform capitalism. Following philosopher Bernard Stiegler, Cy Taffel describes this process whereby knowledge is displaced from humans into machines designed to commodify, privatize, and monetize data, information, and experience as a proletarianization of the user. The impending metaverse, as envisaged by the tech companies, will perhaps be a final installation in this attempt to not only fully automate our perception, but also commodify it. And of course, things don't have to be this way. Prediction needn't be seen as a passive enterprise, an impassionate observation of what will have happened. Having buried the indexical fantasies of photography, we can instead explore the idea of photographing the future as a form of creation, an imaginative rendering of a future we would like to see. And I'm kind of riffing here of Bergson's Matter and Memory. The open-ended concept of the future is already implicitly embraced by Adobe, Facebook, and other giants of the tech industry, although in supporting a particular form of popular and populist data exchange on their platforms, they end up consolidating the contrary belief that the future is inevitable, something that can at best be predicted, a belief that of course works in the service of those companies. Yet, as poignantly phrased by Nick Montfort, the future is not something to be predicted, but to be made. We mustn't therefore just respond to the tech companies' visions and vistas, but offer a vision of our own, an approach Montfort describes as future making, and that's the kind of project I've been involved both in my lab and with some, in my own work. We must therefore change the key parameters of the prediction machine while making use of its warped temporality. Photographing the future can become a way of not just seeing what will happen, but of creating images of what we want to happen, of how we want the world to look, and making better choices from within the image stack. The shift is to take cognizance of the fact that, as discussed in this talk, computational imaging is always a form of buffering, with a singular image being just a cut in the range of possibilities. So we can always make better selections and better cuts. Thank you.